Chapter 2. The Errand. "One cheese sandwich coming right up, Miss Stewart," the baker said, dropping new coins into her outstretched palm. "There, I think that's supposed to be proper change, though you better count it again for me." Amandine examined them in her palm for a moment. "I'm so glad they made the dimes bigger than the nickels now. It makes sense, since they're worth more." The baker prepared her order, watching her carefully while she browsed the humble cakes on display. He didn't recognize Amandine when she first stepped into his shop. She was a wisp of the schoolgirl that she used to be, but her familiar order and glowing smile endured throughout the years of hardship. He rolled the bag shut and passed it over the counter. "Mr. White, do you know if our post office is reopened yet?" She stuffed the bag under her coat. "I need to get a letter to my mother and tell her I sold the estate." "You sold the Stewart place?" Mr. White exclaimed. "Is that what brings you down from the big house after so long?" "That's right," she chirped. "But if folks ask, you can tell them I was driven out by a 3-year-long hankering for a cheese sandwich." Mr. White laughed on his way to the refrigerator. "I think Parisville's the closest town that still gets regular mail." He returned with a cold soda in a green glass bottle. "This is for the road. I reckon Cold River won't be seeing much more of the Stewart family, so take this, with my best wishes." "Thanks, Mr. White," she said. "I'm certainly going to miss your cheese sandwiches." "Any idea where you're going?" "Nieuwestad." "Nieuwestad, New York? Land's sakes, that's a very long ways away. Are you going for your mother?" "Yes, sir. I figured that I'd work to pay my way and save my nickels for my mom's defense," she explained. Like most people in Cold River, Mr. White knew the Stewarts well, and it saddened him to see that this was how it ended for their family in this town. "It's a damn shame what happened to Caroline," he grunted. "I remember when Willie brought her back from France back in '22, everybody was worried that she wouldn't get along out here in the sticks." "Really?" Amandine perked. "It's true," he said. "You could tell she was a high-class lady. She didn't talk much at first, but she ended up being even easier to get on with than your stubborn dad. He was a good man, but that pride got the best of him sometimes. Caroline, on the other hand, was an angel. Didn't matter if you were king or cotton picker, she'd treat you with the same kindness." "Well, that sounds about right," Amandine murmured. She didn't realize that she'd started squeezing the long silver locket around her neck until the hinge bit into her palm. "Well, I'd better be on my way, sir. Got a lot of miles to cover." "When you get to Parisville, look for my cousin Nathaniel's store on the near side of town, just past the bridge. It's White's, same as mine. If you tell him I sent you, he might give you a meal for some work." Before she left, the baker added earnestly, "You be careful now, young lady." Amandine waved, and the door chimed brightly behind her. "Goodbyes aren't so bad if you've got bells to say them for you," she decided, popping the cap off her soda bottle and mounting her bike. There was still plenty of time left in the day for the long ride to Parisville, so Amandine decided to take the road through town. She cruised down the empty, littered Main Street one last time, past broken windows that made the vacant stores gape open like caves. Contrary to what the Nar party had promised, nothing looked like the shimmering utopian pictures they'd passed around during the Depression, and the war had only made things worse. There was no bounty of food, only ration cards. There were no happy, smiling families, just men sent to serve before they could finish school, and women whisked away to replacement homes if they had nobody to care for them. Still, Amandine thought things weren't so bad. At least people could eat again, even if it was heavily regulated by government storehouses, and the streets weren't an open war zone anymore. She glided around ruts and potholes. Of all the things that our party said they'd fix, I suppose they never said anything about the roads. Amandine was glad to see that the only place that didn't have a single broken window was Master Elegance, a 2-storied brownstone store that once drew the eastern elite to the rural town of Cold River. She didn't know if vandals avoided Master Elegance because of its visibility at the corner of a prominent intersection, or out of respect for its former owner. She smiled at her own reflection that seemed to roll right through the dusty gilded mirrors and toppled mannequins inside. Beneath layers of anti-government graffiti, Amandine could still make out the cheery message on the sign out of town. "Please visit Cold River again soon." Maybe someday. She knew better than to try and wave again. Today, Nieuwestad calls. Amandine didn't encounter many other travelers on the road to Parisville, but those who did pass her saw a girl visibly affected by the war and her frailty. She was a small, skinny thing, wearing a man's jacket over her old drop-waist dress, and her curly brown hair was cropped short beneath a gray cloche hat. Since she believed that venturing out on her own was a very special occasion, she put on her last pair of stockings, but they were made for a much healthier woman, and they sagged around her thin legs. If somebody were to judge her by her appearance, Amandine hardly resembled someone who had once been heiress to a fabric fortune. Some people might say that fortune is fickle, coming and going when you least expect it, Amandine remembered her father telling her once. But I say that just because fortune's turned her back on you doesn't mean you're powerless. You've got to bring her back round yourself. Don't ever just sit by as long as you can still stand on your own 2 feet. Will Stewart had tried to instill his hard-working, pragmatic ideals on his daughter since the day she was born. After all, he was proof that with squared shoulders and determination, no problem was insurmountable. He would remind her that when he was called to fight in the Great War, he worked hard and made himself into a captain. When he came home to find his father's business in shambles, he turned the dilapidated storefront into a fine textile factory and a world-renowned clothing label. He even refused to take the Depression lying down. As the country suffered a decade of poverty and political unrest, he protected not only his family and business, but the entire rural community of Cold River by securing a contract making uniforms for the newly elected in our party. "Everything will be all right, Button," Will had said, inviting young Amandine to see the stack of open mail on his desk. They were all thank-you letters from his employees, praising him for not cutting a single job while so many other people in the country had lost everything. Will looked from the letters to the new uniform sketches pinned to his wall. He proudly touched his favorite design, a slender black suit. "It's not haute couture anymore, but it's the dignity and pride of service to our country." At 14, Amandine got to experience fickle fortune herself when her father's world of carefree comfort collapsed around her. The Second World War was someone else's concern, a far-off problem, until it took Will away and never brought him home. Without his direction, the factory closed, too. She wanted to do as her father said and turn her own luck around, but when the Nar found themselves fighting for the losing side in the war, everything turned worse than it had ever been during the Depression. Sickness wiped out entire towns, money became worthless, and every day became a grueling hunt for food. Rumors spread that women were being bought and sold in replacement homes, a government welfare program meant to aid unwed mothers. The practice was apparently so lucrative that corrupt administrators had begun to abduct young women, even girls who didn't have men to defend them. Because of this, Caroline had warned her daughter against ever leaving the house, and Amandine reluctantly agreed. The girl tried not to let her confinement bother her too much. She decided that if her circumstances were beyond her control, she could always change her outlook. Ignoring the hunger pangs in her stomach, she gleaned a little happiness from sewing projects and spending time in the library. In a way, those things made her father feel a little closer. Will had been gone for nearly a year, when one day starvation finally drove Amandine from the house and into the wilderness. As she rooted around the cold earth beneath the pecan trees, she spotted a tiny speck of yellow in a clearing and discovered a patch of newly sprouted dandelions. Hands quaking with joy, she gathered as much as she could find and ran back to their dark, empty mansion. "Look, Maman," she beamed, rinsing the leaves in icy water. "Our luck has finally turned." Caroline scowled at the bowl of weeds in the sink, her gaunt face set hard as stone. "Indeed, ma jolie, I think this is only the beginning." She was right. For the next 2 years, Caroline left Amandine alone in the house frequently, but she always returned with a sack of food. It wasn't much at first, just enough to fit in a canister she hid in the dumbwaiter, but it was better than weeds and wormy pecans. Amandine tried to ask where the food came from, but the only answer Caroline gave her was, "A friend at the storehouse." Gradually, the bags got a little bigger, and sometimes they came with luxury items like chocolate, blocks of butter, and curiously, real silk stockings. As Amandine feared, their turn of good luck didn't last long. One night she awoke to a commotion downstairs. From her vantage point on the dark landing, she could see into the parlor, where an officer in black had Caroline pinned to the floor. Horror froze her to the spot. There was so much blood. Caroline lay still, her hair soaked red and feebly holding the inquester by the lapels while he panted like an animal above her. Just then, 4 armed policemen burst through the front door. "In here, fellas," she heard the inquester call as he stood up. "She won't fight you. I doubt she can even stand up after the little bump I just gave her." They dragged her to her feet. Like the inquester said, she didn't fight, but her hands still reached for the banister when they passed the stairs. Blood covered Caroline's face like a Venetian mask, and her wide, frantic eyes found Amandine hidden in the dark. Years ago, when music and cocktails would flow late into the night, young Amandine would sneak out of bed and spy on her parents' glittering party guests from the same lofty spot. She had drowsy memories of the smell of gin and lilies, and the scratchy feeling of Caroline's party dress pressed against her cheek as she carried the little girl back to bed. She wondered if her mother was remembering the same thing, because in that instant she looked so terribly sad. Suddenly, Caroline made a split-second decision. She let go of the banister and let the officers tackle her to the ground. "Please, I've done nothing wrong. I was just getting food. Fais attention à lui. Let me go. My husband was a favored citizen. I was just so hungry. S'il vous plaît, fais attention." It was a warning Amandine had heard all of her life. Whenever she left a hot iron unattended or climbed too high on the library ladder, it was always, "Amandine, fais attention." Now they were her mother's last words to her, broken up so that officers would think that she was just begging in French. "Watch out for him. Please, be careful." "Good work, inquester," one of the officers said. "This has got to be the biggest bust in history. We've crippled the insurrection." "Don't start counting chickens," the inquester replied, making a hasty exit. "Get her to the station and throw her in with the others until I can get more agents and transport arranged in Nieuwestad. It ain't over till every one of them is in the ground." The door boomed shut, and hours passed before Amandine emerged, trembling from her hiding place. Not knowing what else to do, she set about washing the bloodstains from the rug. As she scrubbed at the pitch-black spots by lamplight, Amandine realized that she'd always taken a passive approach to her father's advice. She couldn't affect change by simply willing it to go the way she wanted. A smile and a positive attitude wouldn't be enough to bring her mother back. Tossing frothy brown water off the back porch and into the night, Amandine knew that she had to get Caroline out. A few weeks later, when Amandine was appraising the last few valuable trinkets in the house, the local governing administrator himself appeared at her door and complimented her magnificent house. "Hello again, Fortune," she thought to herself, welcoming Peter Graft into the parlor. "I hope you stick around a little longer this time." All of these events brought Amandine to where she was now, pedaling down a rugged path to recover her mother. She didn't know what she would say when she finally reached the prison. She didn't even know how she would get there. All she knew for certain was that she had to try. That afternoon she came out of the forested country to the river and saw the town of Parisville on the other side. The old bridge had been a casualty of the civil conflict, and its burnt remains crumbled into the gushing current. Amandine searched for a place to cross and spotted a narrow, temporary bridge made of rope and chains nearby. She pedaled across, mindful of the irregular gaps in the scrapwood slats. Her cloche hat narrowed her view like a horse's blinders, so she didn't see the delivery truck roll onto the opposite end of the bridge until she felt a rumble in her handlebars. "Hey!" She waved her arm and swerved to a stop. "Look out, mister!" The driver either didn't see her or simply didn't care. Amandine had no choice but to abandon her bike and scramble over the rope railing to avoid being hit. The truck knocked the bike over the edge, but Amandine managed to grab the handle of her suitcase before it fell. The twine that secured it to the back couldn't hold, and she watched in dismay as her bicycle splashed into the rushing brown waters below. Amandine tossed her suitcase back onto the bridge and climbed over, rubbing her chafed hands together while the truck sped away. "Oh, golly, I've lost my bike. How in the world am I supposed to get to Nieuwestad now?" She squeezed her belongings to her chest. "Keep on the sunny side, Amandine. Count your blessings. Name them one by one. 1, you ain't hurt. 2, you saved your suitcase. 3, maybe this new Mr. White can make you another cheese sandwich for supper." That was all she needed to collect herself, and she quickly lugged her suitcase across the bridge before another car came. Parisville was recovering well, considering it had been the site of a particularly bloody conflict between the rebels and the police only a year before. Children played in the streets unsupervised, housewives did their shopping, and a cafe played patriotic music while it served its diners. Amandine let her nose guide her to the town bakery, a clean white building with lace curtains in the window and a printed pink sign that read, "Chocolate Confections, first time since the war, only at White's." She smiled when the door chimed, and a woman in a pink apron greeted her from behind a scrubbed countertop. "Welcome, young lady. How may I help you?" Amandine liked bakeries. The warm smell of bread and sugar wrapped her in an olfactory blanket of comfort and brought her back to Saturday mornings before the war, when she'd wake up to the smell of cinnamon rolls and coffee downstairs. Amandine inhaled deeply before she replied. "I just came from Cold River, ma'am, and I'm on my way to Nieuwestad. Mr. Clarence White there told me that I might get some work from Mr. Nathaniel White here." Now that the woman knew that Amandine wasn't going to buy anything, the smile she put on for customers fell away. She paused to mull the idea over, thoughtfully touching her blonde set curls. "Did he? Well, I suppose we'll see about that. My name's Betsy White. Nathaniel's my husband." She looked Amandine over. "Are you a baker?" "No, ma'am. I'm a tailor's daughter." The baker's nails clicked with incredulity on the countertop. Amandine's clothes were well kept and neat, but decades out of fashion. "And where are your parents?" "My father was killed in action, and my mother's in the Nieuwestad prison of war criminals. I'm on my way to get her released," Amandine replied. Mrs. White inhaled deeply. "Bless your heart." Amandine cringed. She must have looked very pitiful or sounded very stupid to have earned a condescending response like that. "And what's your name, sugar?" Amandine began to get the feeling that Mrs. White didn't want the daughter of a tailor or an accused criminal to work for her, but she didn't let the smile on her face falter. "My name's Amandine Stewart, ma'am. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance." Mrs. White's face moved with recognition. "Stewart, you say? Of the fabric factory in Cold River? And the design label?" "Yes. Well, I was." "Well, I do declare," the baker brightened. "I loved your fabrics. Never bought any of your dresses myself, but I used your material to make all my curtains and towels before the war, and they still hold their color like new." She paused before asking carefully, "But whatever happened? Last I heard, Mr. Stewart was commissioned by the government to make all the servicemen's uniforms." "It's true, but he answered the call about 3 years ago." Amandine shrugged and rubbed the edge of her coat between her fingers. "Guess they needed a sailor more than a tailor. We lost him, and Maman couldn't keep the business without him." "Oh, bless your heart." This time the phrase was soft as meringue, and Mrs. White reached for Amandine's hat. "Take this off. Hang your things and come into the kitchen. I've just the job to suit you." She swapped her coat for an apron and led the girl into the back room. "You came at just the right time. My husband's out running errands, and I was just working on a big chocolate order." "Your kitchen looks very nice." The girl admired the clean, enameled ovens and linoleum floor that had been scrubbed so much that they were beginning to show wear down to the black layer beneath. "Golly, looks like it's right out of a Good Housekeeping ad." Mrs. White moved a wooden stool in front of a table stacked high with boxes and tissue paper. "It's part of White's purity guarantee. While other bakeries cut their flour with plaster and baked their bricks in oil drums, we always baked real bread in a proper kitchen. We made sure to clean every day, even when there wasn't a flake of soap to be found." Amandine glanced at the bar of soap that she'd just picked up at the sink. She quickly put it back into the graniteware soap dish and lathered the residue until it bubbled between her fingers. "How did you manage to stay open when flour was worth its weight in gold?" She dried her hands on a towel made from a familiar pink material. "Oh, it was tricky for a while. I suspect our regular supplier might have been dealing in black market flour." Mrs. White quickly considered what she'd just said before adding, "But it's not likely. He probably had a business connection at the storehouse." "Really? I hope it wasn't the same guy my mother knew, because I think that's how she got mistaken for an insurrectionist." Amandine sat on the stool and examined the supplies in front of her. "Hogwash! Mama loved jazz and fashion. She didn't give a fig about politics. That was Dad's favorite topic, and he was a favored citizen of the Nar. All of this is just a big misunderstanding, which I'll straighten out as soon as I get to Nieuwestad." Mrs. White squinted at the odd girl for some time. When the pause began to drag on for too long, Amandine turned on the swiveling stool and chirped, Want me to box up these chocolates, ma'am?
Mrs. White sighed. Yes, sugar. Let me show you how to do it. She arranged the treats in pretty paper cups and pink tissue paper. Looks easy enough. But presentation is key. Mrs. White tied the lid shut with a white ribbon. She set the completed box aside. There you have it. Now, I'll be making chocolates right behind you if you have any questions. I need 10 boxes of a dozen packed for the order, plus a few more to put in the window. Amandine saluted and got to work. She found that packing chocolates wasn't too different from the more familiar task of packing garment boxes, so her eyes strayed from her hands to her surroundings. She scanned the shelves of spices, utensils, and miscellany, and noticed an old radio as she knotted the bow on her first box. May I turn on some music? Amandine asked over her shoulder. Mrs. White pulled a face. I don't care much for the marches. 15 minutes of that same old parum-pum-pum, and I start to feel like I've turned into a mixing machine. My husband keeps that in here to listen to the news. Amandine switched on the radio. Its face glowed yellow, and a piccolo tweeted out a patriotic melody beneath the cheery voice of a radio personality. Listening to How We Are in the Nar. Coming up, he's becoming such a hot topic I'm almost afraid to touch him. Hear how everybody's new favorite inquester single-handedly... The voice slipped into static. Twisting the tuning knob very carefully, Amandine found the signal she was looking for on a low frequency and tapped her Mary Jane in time to the old dance record. Mrs. White's mouth fell open in shock. That's a pirate station. This station's good, the girl said, as if she hadn't heard her. Mama and I listened to this after we had to turn all of our dance records in for food rations. Turn it off. Beg your pardon? Jazz is illegal. Turn that off at once. Mrs. White flew at the radio, but her hands stopped on the dial. She froze, listening. Amandine beamed, oblivious.
This one's a swell number, isn't it? Mrs. White vanished from the bakery, lost to a summer night long ago. The air buzzed with bugs and electricity, and her new bob haircut tickled her cheeks. She swayed in time to the 12th Street rag, hoping somebody would ask her for a dance when she felt a shy tap on her shoulder. This song was playing at the church social where I met my husband, she whispered, still clinging to a night when she danced until her legs ached and the feverish kiss he stole in the choir loft tasted like lemonade. She smiled and turned the volume up ever so slightly. Feels like a lifetime ago. It's much more fun to work to this kind of music, don't you think? Amandine perched on her stool and continued packing as if she'd done it her entire life. Offhandedly, she added, Something's burning, ma'am. And Mrs. White dashed for the neglected pot of chocolate.
The two continued working, driven by energetic swing until the disc jockey came on. Amandine flung a paper cup aside and clapped her hands. It's DJ M.A., my absolute favorite radio host. Not Mark Antony. Mrs. White's gaze shifted between the front door and the open kitchen window. We haven't been listening to Ptolemy and Cleo's station this whole time, have we? Shh! Amandine fluttered her hand urgently. This is a real treat. He almost never comes on during the day. DJ Mark Antony was an irreverent radio personality with a golden transatlantic voice. Broadcasting from wandering locations, his signal was bounced from pirate station to station, reaching his mysterious network of freedom fighters across the country. Hello everybody, my name is Mark Antony and you are listening to the best station on the radio, the only one that'll satisfy you ducky shin crackers anymore, K-Patriot 550! He spoke in rapid, run-on sentences that sometimes exploded in volume without warning. That's not true, I made it up. Watch the boys in blue and my good old friends the Inquestors try to find my signal out there anyways. You're wasting your time, Inkies, because nobody can find Mark Antony. I'm everywhere, a phantom of the airwaves. No, the only people this guy has his door open to is Ptolemy and Cleo. And guess what? They're in the news again. DJ M.A. hummed idly and rustled his papers while he searched for the article he wanted to talk about. Rebel leader Cleo goes to trial, it says. Ouch. The day they nabbed her was a miserable day for the movement. I was so blue I thought about stringing myself up by my headset, but then I remembered that my sound technician would likely take up my mantle and he doesn't know jazz from a jingle. Don't worry, folks, Mark Antony will persevere. I must, because who else is going to fight for the music? Gotta hand it to him, though. That was probably the biggest bust the Inquestors ever pulled off. They got a lot of our red brothers and sisters that day, and in typical Nah fashion, they dragged in a lot of innocent bystanders, too. Poor folks that were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I bet Catching Cleo and her crew got someone promoted. Oh, look! They printed an awful picture of her. Cleo is an absolute fox, ladies and gentlemen. Don't let the paper tell you otherwise. She's so smoking hot, so beautiful, so fierce and terrifying. They'd have to doctor these photos in order to make her look bad. Sorry, folks. Old Mark's got it bad for Cleo. Anyway, I'm gonna move on before I storm the prison myself and bust her out. Next headline. Tall Me threatens to destroy hospital. Oh, now I doubt that very much. I don't know Tall Me like I know Cleo. He lowered his voice to a suggestive purr, which made Amandine and Mrs. White giggle behind their wrists. But I can bet he's not talking about St. James Infirmary. Let me see here. He paused and mumbled as he scanned the article. Thought so. The so-called hospital happens to be a disease research facility run by one of those overcast krauts. I know this because I have several reliable sources. Why, Mark Antony? You may say. You're holed up at a super-secret location. How reliable can your sources be? Well, I sprung my sources out of the mad scientist lab myself. Me and Cleo. Well, actually, it was Cleo and her crew who did the springing while I watched the door and manned the radio. I am very good at manning the radio, he emphasized defensively. Anyway, at this hospital, they cut into people while they're still awake, torture them, shoot them up full of disease, and just when they run out of usefulness, they get propped up in a field like a bunch of leprous scarecrows and used for target practice. Tall Me is right to make that his next priority. What kind of sicko, blue or not, could do... The bell above the door to the shop chimed, and Amandine reflexively flicked off the radio. Mrs. White wiped her hands on a towel before she picked up the extra boxes of chocolate and floated out to greet the customer. Welcome. How may I help you? Amandine slid off her perch and peered into the shop, where a young man with long, dark hair fumbled with something behind the counter. Good afternoon, madame. I would like to buy some bread, he said, his voice trickling out in a warm French accent. Its familiar sound reminded Amandine of her mother, and she positioned herself to get a better look at this visitor. I know it is late in the day, but I will take whatever you have left. I would also like to pick up the special order for Mrs. Thatch. Of course, Mrs. White said cheerfully. You're welcome to set your parcels on the counter for a moment while we select which breads you like. Thank you, madame. He hefted several large shopping bags onto the counter and managed to get what he was after, his wallet. I need 10 loaves. 10? Mrs. White repeated, flashing all 10 fingers. The young man spoke very clearly, but Amandine supposed that Mrs. White was the kind of person who would inadvertently imitate and belittle anybody with an accent. Yes, madame. I hope it is not an imposition. No, that's good. That'll clean us out for the day. Mrs. White beckoned to Amandine, and she carried out the towering order of chocolates. When he saw the stack of boxes, he took a step back and blinked in surprise. Oh la la, that's a lot. He chuckled nervously. I thought when Carmelita said a few boxes... I am sorry, I will have to return for this. Nonsense, Mrs. White said, taking the cash and food permit he produced from his wallet. She stamped the permit and handed it back with his change. My assistant here can help you. I would be grateful, the young man said kindly. Their eyes met, his bright gray to her brown, and Amandine knew in that instant that she liked him very much. Maybe it was just wishful thinking, but it seemed like he was looking at her in the same way. He reminded her of a character from an adventure story, like a pirate or a gypsy prince, lean, tanned, and scarred from hard work, and dressed in a hodgepodge of worn, foreign clothing. Despite his humble appearance, he was roguishly handsome. She'd never seen anyone like him, but then again, she hadn't seen a young man her age in years either. What was your name, mademoiselle? Amandine, she replied, bagging the chocolates. Enchantée. He touched the brim of his beat-up hat. Amandine, what a beautiful French name you have. Thank you. She shook open more bags while Mrs. White filled them with random loaves of bread. What's yours? Renee? Are you hosting a last-minute dinner party, Mr. Renee? The girl nodded at all of his sacks of food. It's for my family, he explained. There are 17 of us, so I suppose you could say every night is a dinner party. Surely you could have recruited a little sister or brother to help you carry all this, Mrs. White put in. You know siblings, he smiled. Some of them would rather starve than help me. He scooped up his packages, and Amandine grabbed the rest. Thank you for the bread and for lending me this charming helper. Please return her in one piece. Mrs. White held the door for them as they tottered out. I want that apron back.